Today's theme is receptivity. It's easy to hear a word like receptivity and to immediately add connotations of gentle or soft. Yes, sometimes. And we access our receptivity by softening, by consciously allowing and being with and connecting with the qualities of openness and empty space rather than filling, doing, forcing, or asserting. But at the same time, receptivity is an absolutely powerful force. I would suggest that it is the seat of true power, of authentic power. And by this, I mean not a power over, not the quality of power that we see modeled by patriarchy, but power with. Everything that we will do and learn in this course around restoring the deep feminine is, as I've mentioned before, about going down and in to our bodies. Our bodies are a center for relational intelligence, for natural intelligence beyond what you can imagine. Our bodies are the center for power with. We might think of power as one's ability to give and receive love in every moment and at the most subtle level, to give and receive love moment by moment. Again, even love is something we can, through delusion, bring in connotations of gentleness or softness, as next week we'll be diving into fierce compassion and igniting the fire element of the deep feminine. I can share now, and many of you know this well in your practice, that love is sometimes gentle and sometimes fierce. Both are required and both are accessed when we go down and into our bodies. So please take a deep breath. Just noticing how you are listening to my words, my transmission today. Noticing how you are in your own body and being, allowing a little less effort and a little more space to receive. Just listening into your own receptivity for a moment. We do this work around restoring the deep feminine because humanity at this time needs a radical path to wholeness, a return to wholeness. And we cannot be whole in ourselves or as a collective if we are quite aggressively cutting off one entire half of our being. And that is the receptive over the expressive, the feminine over the masculine, the lunar over the solar. We could go on and on, cutting off the dark in preference for the light. So this is a time when, in the name of wholeness, we have to restore that which we've forgotten and aggressively, I want to say rejected, but also demonized. And I'll talk about that in a moment. We are Homo sapiens, Homo, human, sapien, wise, wisdom. Practice, and the whole reason we practice helps us to remember who and what we actually are. Wise beings, shared presence, a wise shared consciousness that is so much bigger, more boundless, freer, more vast than the very limiting lens of separate self. the teeny tiny I, me, and my meanness that we are all caught in to some degree. We're caught in it because that's simply the result of capitalism, colonialism, separate from nature, patriarchy, meanness, small me, small I. Throughout history, there have been so many wisdom traditions, so many land-based indigenous traditions that have known and some who have not forgotten uh, the balance of the masculine and feminine, the wisdom of the deep feminine. And perhaps before we continue, I'll simply acknowledge historically, I think it's safe to say that the uh, disconnect, the rejection of the feminine, really began about 12,000 years ago when we took on agriculture, when we actually started working the land and started owning land. And this began sort of a patrilineal, uh, the men own the land, and the men in stronger bodies carried suddenly a hierarchical position over women in many societies. This is how the shift occurred. This is also when our incredible disconnect from nature occurred, because for the first time, it was not so much about living in partnership with nature, but ownership. And we could even acknowledge that this was a time in which many of the more feminine based forms of spirituality, different forms of knowing beyond the rational mind, started to feel like a threat to men. The connection I want to make is that there was a rejection of darkness and the deep feminine, a rejection of other forms of knowing over rationalization that's pretty much colonized our entire world. Look within and see if that feels safe to say that rationalization has attempted to colonize our entire globe. Okay, rationalization takes us up and out of our bodies. No need to honor the wisdom of the body. We faced a few other really profound forces in history. One is that through Christianity and the church, there was no longer the uh, experience, which was known for a long, long time in many, many wisdom traditions, of body as vessel, body as connection to the divine, no separation at all between body and spirit. And suddenly that was pushed away in order that people could go through the male dominated church in order to access their connection to spirit, their connection to wisdom, their connection to God, their connection to information. This is really important to name. In the Cartesian era, there was a deeper upsurge of rationalization as God or king, as what was most important, we might say. And of course, this led to the burning times, not just the um, murder of so many people experienced as witches and witchcraft, but actually what has been identified as the Holocaust of the feminine, over 9 million killings happening in about a 300-year period, referred to now as the burning times. So it's really important to name and presence these things, just to see what happened, starting with our disconnect from the natural world. That's where it begins. What happened that now today we can see so many subtle and not so subtle at all impacts of a separation between feminine and masculine. There's both patriarchy in its conventional definition, simply as if we look pretty much everywhere around the entire world, more power is in the hands of men. And we can also acknowledge that there are many societies, that became patrilineal instead of matrilineal. But to note that there are still certain societies that are matrilineal that are alive today. I've identified 6. There's a society in China, in Kenya, in Costa Rica, in Ghana, that are still matrilineal today, in India. In ancient Egypt, which was a matrilineal society, there are statues, some of you have probably seen them, where, and also paintings, where the male and female are standing together, and it's the woman's arm that is around the waist of the man, not vice versa. So we have to acknowledge that the world has not always been this way. And today, we see the presence and the impact and the residue of this rejection and demonization of the feminine in so many ways, and it impacts people of every gender. So this is not, as I stated before, just about male versus female. It impacts people of every gender. For me personally, as a meditation teacher, as a teacher of Dharma, which even in itself has been impacted by patriarchy and impacted by this obsession with rationalization rather than embodiment and other forms of knowing, I just want to name that my direct experience, and I only teach through direct experience, is that the deeper my practice went, the more a reawakening occurred to my body as a vessel for wisdom, attunement, relational intelligence, and collaboration with the cosmos beyond anything I had ever imagined or known. And there was a bit of a shock to this, like, how did I grow up in a society that considers itself evolved without ever actually being told that this is the truth of my body, that this is the truth of this vessel? I had always been a receptive person, certainly. That's a very strong muscle in my being, but I never valued my receptivity. I always took it for granted. And the more I practiced, which allowed me to soften and really let go of all doing, all rationalization, all mental activity, which, by the way, doesn't mean that if you're not able to let go of mental activity, you can't drop into full presence. You can. Sinking down into the wisdom of the body itself and simply hanging out in receptive, empty space. In that place, all power was and is returned. It's in the empty space that all power is returned. It's only in the present moment and in our bodies that we can remember the power of our receptivity, the power of our ability to attune, to listen deeply, to be connected with other forms of life across the planet and across all of time. So please pause and close your eyes for a minute. And just notice how you're receiving my words. In today's world, in very practical ways, we experience the rejection of the feminine, not simply through misogyny, and male dominance. We experience it in so many ways that manifest in how we do what we do, that manifest in unconscious biases and preferences. And I simply want to name some of these so you can reflect in yourself for a moment. But simply be bias towards rationalization, cognitive understanding, a particular masculine framework for what understanding is, which we see pervades even the modern Buddhist world, even the mindfulness world, for sure, for certain. We see it in a preference towards speed, doing, productivity, getting somewhere, which has also been part of the influence of capitalism, and capitalism kind of seals the deal. So when I ask people to slow down and consider that they might be able to live their entire lives slowed down through a subtle shift of attention, that slowing down is the place where we access the body's wisdom and our relational intelligence, the place that we can actually listen to the cosmos moment by moment. People will sometimes use the excuse, but I can't, my work won't let me, or I can't because I've got to stay at the top, or I can't. They'll use a capitalistic reason to justify. And what I love about this work, by the way, is that it's very revolutionary. You have to go beyond those collective biases. Even when I'm talking to people who work for a corporation, I say it's not that black and white. It's not that you're either going to work for the corporation and simply live only in the domain of speed, or slow down and get fired. There are a million places in between where you can find your right relationship. Okay, slowing down and balancing productivity and attunement. We see it in the rejection of curiosity and the assertion of judgment instead of curiosity. Judgment gives the mind a known place to stand. Judgment gives identity a big boost. This is who I am. This is what I like and what I don't like. This is my opinion. This is what I believe in. Curiosity is empty space. Curiosity is openness, interconnection. Interestingly enough, curiosity is also the force that guides feminine spirituality. But if you haven't, and feminine sexuality, but if you haven't noticed, male sexuality tends to win out, and there's a big emphasis on focus on the orgasm in our world today. We see this bias in a preference towards force as strength rather than the strength that exists in gentleness, the skillfulness and grace and dignity and humility that exists in gentleness. We see this in the preference towards controlling. Consider what I'm saying for a moment. Controlling. We're very focused on controlling life as a culture and controlling nature rather than consciously allowing, which again is a expression of receptivity. So just notice how my words are impacting you, and notice, if you will, which, if any, of these areas I'm naming feel most relevant to your life right now. An area that either you've really seen yourself grow and begin to come into rebalance, or an area where you can really see yourself caught and want to look and investigate. So even in just such a brief experience of connecting, and we're connecting on Zoom through a screen with one another, but because we are dropped into shared presence, because we're showing up connected, going down and into our bodies, what we connect to is the shared heart. That's who we really are. The shared heart. That's a powerful place to be. All of these qualities that you're naming come from this reality. And it's important to name that it's reality. Why? Because we spend so much time in delusion. Because our society spends most of its time in delusion today. because we've separated from wholeness, from the feminine in balance with the masculine. So I also want to acknowledge, simply while you're hanging out together in that quality of sharing, there's a going into the unscripted, vulnerable, open, empty space of darkness to share yourself, to speak from your heart. And how many of you experience, either now or in general in your life, how many of you know the power? I'm using that word intentionally, it's important. The power of that unscripted, vulnerable, unknown place. Raise your hand. Yeah, it's the most powerful place we can share ourselves from. And listening from receptivity, again, the dark, unscripted, empty, we're emptied out. It's not me and my agenda here, but the empty space that is who I really am. How many have experienced the power of receiving another from that place? Yes. So when we're talking about receptivity, we're actually talking about power. And if you look receptivity up in the dictionary, I promise it's not going to mention